Question 3. You say the world has something called moral order. I think that's a disputatious claim, but we'll accept it for the sake of a response. So where do I get my morals from? The same place you probably do. Parents, school, peers, and my investigation into what constitutes justice, fairness, and ethical behavior. Consider what else this answer explains, though. It goes beyond explaining moral behavior alone. It would also explain much of the immoral behavior we see in the world, such as when Jews mutilate the genitalia of their children, or when Muslims murder the victims of rape, or when Christians relegate homosexuals to a category of citizen less than their own, all while feeling righteous and justified. So ask yourself, does your explanation for the occurrence of morality take into account behavior which is seemingly aberrant in the light of the objective moral standard Christians typically insist is imbued in us all? That is, if moral order prevails, how do you account for the people who act immorally by your standards, the standards you purport are imbued in us all, yet as a result of their upbringing find their behavior much more than acceptable, but judge their behavior to in fact be righteous? Or is morality not innate? Can true morality only be attained through Christianity? If so, how does this square with the prevailing moral order you say is evident in the world? So I have to ask, why is this a huge problem for atheists and not a problem for the Christian? Ethics isn't easy stuff. What makes you think you have it all worked out? I presume that as a Christian you pick and choose which archaic prescriptions to abandon and which to embrace. But you clearly don't use the moral standard of the Bible to do so. So where do you get your moral standard from? Well, probably your parents, your culture, your peers, school, and TV. The problem you see is only a problem within the framework of the assumption that there must be a divine lawgiver, or at least an objective morality, and it's as much a problem for a person who frowns on polygamy, as I'm sure you do, and claims to be a Christian, as it is for an atheist. You say morality is prescriptive, and yet evolution does not engage that very fundamental point about what morality is. Well, no, and you never asked it to. You're missing the point of your own question. You asked, where do we get our morality from? Not whether or not the origin provided in the answer lends legitimacy or authority to any moral prescriptions whatsoever. The question posed invites a descriptive response, not a prescriptive one. So you invited a descriptive answer, summarized the answer evolutionary theory provides, then insist that this description doesn't lend moral prescriptions a foundation, because such a foundation would take an argumentative form, not a descriptive one. Then you turn it around and say, but morality still needs to be explained. But it has been explained, at least insofar as you have asked it to be. It goes the same for your likely answer. If I ask you, from where do you take your moral code, and you answer, from the Bible, this answer does not explain why your moral code should be evaluated as ethical, or why one of your morals is an acceptable prescription. It merely explains your moral code's origin. This is a bait-and-switch game, you see. So you answered your own question. Now to the question you meant to ask. How would I justify telling a person not to commit murder? Well, by appealing to his sense of empathy, his sense of fairness, his reason, and his own self-interest. Not to the existence of a sky fairy who will rebuke him if he behaves poorly. He doesn't want to be murdered just like the would-be victim doesn't want to be murdered, and if he doesn't agree to play by the rules, no one else will treat him as a participant in the social order, and he'll likely be killed or imprisoned, much as God threatens hell upon sinners. To question 4. The idea that morality evolved with mankind does not entail that something in us is aware of the process of evolution or where it is going, and no reasonable person who understands evolutionary theory would say as much. This is a complete non sequitur, or at worst, a misrepresentation of the evolutionary explanation for the emergence of morality. It also belies a misunderstanding of evolution, again, on your part. Morality is not necessarily forward-looking as you've described it. Different ethical standards put varying amounts of emphasis on the future. Deontology, or duty-based ethics, places practically zero emphasis on the outcome. The same goes for virtue ethics. Utilitarianism focuses exclusively on the impact of a decision and is therefore more oriented toward future outcomes. Christian morality demands that a person act according to God's will, not in such a way as to produce a particular outcome. God has forbidden certain behaviors, and that is all there is to it. The list goes on, and your assertion that morality is an enterprise or a given moral prescription is forward-looking is just absurd to anyone who has given the subject some study or thought. A specific moral choice can be forward-looking, but the moral enterprise as a whole would probably not be, and certainly not according to the evolutionary explanation for the occurrence of morality. Such an explanation would probably go something like this. Certain social behaviors would be adopted by certain members of our ancestry, and their survival would be better ensured and their way of life would be passed on, whereas the habits and social strictures of more fiercely individualistic, competitive, or violent groups would likely not be. This again is the simple work of natural selection. And other more inclusive explanations are out there, of course. But consider how much sense it makes. Certain moral prescriptions are found almost everywhere, like the prohibition of murder, largely because groups that permit murder typically have problems functioning very well for very long. The short-term benefits of members of a society agreeing not to murder one another are all that society needs to establish that prohibition. The long-term evolutionary benefits never really enter into it. Other prescriptions are less common, either because they confer fewer benefits or perhaps merely because they are more recent emergence and have been competing for a shorter period of time. Your two cavemen argument is just silly. You are not being asked to believe that one of them feels guilt over the act of killing because of the act's impact on the species' descendants, which incidentally might be positive. This is a consequence of your misunderstanding of the evolutionary explanation. Science does not purport an ability on the part of the individual to know what is ultimately in his and or the species' best interest. No such foreknowledge follows from the evolutionary explanation for the occurrence of morality. If you had taken the time to fully understand the role of natural selection, this probably would have been apparent to you. You suggest that in the rest of the animal kingdom, killing the opposition is advantageous. This is just another instantiation of your habit of ignoring contrary evidence. In fact, we find many types of behavior in the rest of the animal kingdom when we take the trouble to look. Our primate kin have been observed engaging in behavior that demonstrates a sense of fairness, just like us. And we have also observed them waging war, just like we do. This is of course in keeping with the scientific contention that we are closely related to them, and flies rather in the face of many intelligent design advocates' ideas about some mythical separation between us and them. But the truth is it goes beyond us primates. Lions and dolphins hunt in packs. Ants build bridges out of their own bodies. Many different species will adopt orphaned children. All of these species seem to be observing a principle of cooperation, and they typically have highly ordered hierarchies and formalisms which, in a very general way, resemble what we might call a very crude form of morality. But typically, animals do not wantonly kill their own kind without provocation or when a resource is not in dispute. So when you say it makes no sense whatsoever, I understand why. You haven't taken the trouble to understand the argument, and your incredulous claim that this is all morality ends up being ought to be turned on the moral system you claim to accept, because I can just as incredulously say that all morality ends up being, according to your beliefs, is the idea that there's a big guy in the sky who will be extremely unhappy if you don't jump through his hoops. Question number 5. Can nature generate complex organisms when previously there was none? Well, I'm not a biologist, but yes, to the best of my understanding. You ask, where else does this take place in our universe? I can't point to a place, but I know of no reason to think the Earth enjoys some special privilege as the sole platform upon which life can arise or is possible. Do you know of any such reason? You say intelligence leaves behind a characteristic trademark or signature, something specific and complex by nature. It has to be contingent and not necessary, complex and therefore not readily repeatable by chance. You also say if I shoot an arrow at a wall and draw a bullseye around it, I'm imposing a pattern after the fact. You seem to think that this is what atheists have done. In fact, it's more akin to what you have done. Now, the universe is arranged in such a way as to produce life. That isn't in dispute. Atheists and scientists don't paint a bullseye around this fact any more than you do. And this is where atheists and scientists stop. You, on the other hand, want to insist that this is so fortuitous an occurrence that it clearly indicates a designer, some intelligence influencing the outcome. You see an arrow embedded in a range of possibilities and think that the point at which it has come to rest is unique. The arrow happens to have struck a point which permits life, but you know of no reason to conclude that this is the only point in the field of possibilities which could have produced life. You see, you look at life in its complexity, the order you see in our world and our universe, and you declare emphatically, "Bullseye! God is evident!" You are insisting that where the arrow happens to have struck is actually the bullseye, when, for all you know, it's just another point in a range of possibilities which permit life, order, and complexity. You say that all around us it makes sense to infer a designer from complexity, except for the atheist. But you're mistaken. When I find a pocket watch, I know that there was a maker because I know what watches are, and I know who makes them. I don't deduce from its complexity that it was made by artifice. I deduce that it was made by men because I know what watches are, and I know what watchmakers are. I have foreknowledge of the artifact in question. If I were a primitive human and had no such foreknowledge of watches or machines, when I found one I would probably deduce not that some human being much smarter than me designed and built it. I would probably skip that hypothesis altogether. I would probably conclude that God made it. Now this is a somewhat subtle point. I want you to take the time to try to understand why this is poignant. God did not make the watch I found. A human did, because watches are made by men. But in my ignorance, I concluded from its complexity and beauty in the absence of any other explanation or reason, that its origin was divine, exactly as you have done with the universe. But while we both agree that I would have been wrong in my deduction that God made the watch, only one of us thinks the same deductive process applies to the universe as a whole. This is the Godless Heathen signing off.